Hello, I'm Howie Sheriff, and welcome to our early version of the You Call This Yoga internet talk show. We're starting a half hour early during the month of March in correspondence with daylight savings time. Actually, not, it's the opposite. We're starting early in March because I have the luxury of teaching nearby at NC State University, and I had to adjust the show. So hopefully most of you have remembered that and are tuning in at 9:30 during the month of March. Our show is about accessible yoga and the leaders in our field and allied fields who are bringing yoga to the community, providing an accessible platform for people to experience the life science of yoga. Yoga is more than just a physical practice. There are 8 limbs of yoga, and we'll be discussing manners that these other limbs are able to be accessed for accessible yoga. Today's guest is Michelle Johnson, a registered yoga teacher, 500 hour, who has a yoga school in Carborough, North Carolina, called Skill and Action. Michelle will be sharing how she creates yoga in a skill and action mode so that the community and the world can experience the benefits. During the show, we'll have commercials or pearls of wisdom that Michelle has constructed. And we'll also be having a sponsor spot from Neoman Deli and Catering. So we thank Neoman for sponsoring our show. Let's bring on Michelle and learn a little bit about her history and how she became curious and interested in yoga. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Howie.
Hi. How did you first find out about yoga?
I went to college in Williamsburg, Virginia, the College of William and Mary, and I had to take a PE class, and we explored different exercises in that, and there was actually a yoga class there, and that's the first time I practiced yoga. And it was in a gym setting. And then I practiced yoga when I moved to North Carolina for graduate school in social work. And again, that was a gym setting that I went to, but I practiced pretty regularly. And Carborough Yoga Company opened across the street from my house several years ago. And one day I walked in, and then I started my practice of yoga every day, the physical practice of yoga every day. And it was very different to practice in a studio versus a gym setting. So I was hooked pretty quickly and got exposed to lots of different teachers and styles of yoga.
Mm-hmm. So if someone is in a gym setting and they were curious about a studio, any tips that you would share for people to prepare for some of that transition?
Well, I do want to say that I think wherever people can practice yoga, it's good. So a gym, a studio, outside your living room, wherever it is, I feel like people, it's more about just moving through the practice. What I noticed around the transition from the gym to the studio is that it just felt different to me. The studio is a space that's dedicated to the practice of yoga, and again, not just the physical practice. There were meditation classes there, they had beginners yoga classes there. They had a class that was focused on a Dharma talk and cultivating compassion. So they had many different types of yoga, which I don't feel like gyms always have that available to people. And, you know, in the gym, when I was practicing yoga, I looked out through the glass and there were people on the treadmill and there's a lot of other activity going on. And I felt like in the yoga studio, it was focused on yoga. It was a quiet space. And I think if someone's looking for a space to practice yoga out in public, if they're going to go to a studio or a gym, that they just want to feel like they're welcome there, and that they can show up and practice and do that freely and openly without feeling like they need to compete with other people, or they just need to feel like it's accessible for them in some way.
Mm-hmm. We had Diane Bondi on last week, who was sharing her perspectives on yoga and inclusion, uh, dealing with race as well as body size. How was your experience when you first started practicing in a studio and the demographics of that group and how that seems to have changed over time?
Well, I'm trying to remember. In college, when I started practicing, I'm pretty sure I was the only person of color in the class. There may have been one other person of color. And when I started practicing yoga in the studio, and I've practiced in a few studios around Chapel Hill and Carborough and some in Durham, I'm one of a few people of color. But I go to places like DC, or further west even, and there are more people of color in those classes. And so it is not unusual for me to be the only person of color, if I'm making assumptions about people's races, but visibly the only person of color in the class as the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really interesting because I think the sort of corporate face of yoga journal usually has white people on the cover, or mostly white people throughout. I know that that's changed over the last 10 years, but still, I think the public face of yoga, the corporate face of yoga, is typically white women who are skinny. And I think that if Yoga Journal is what's being marketed and that's what people see, then they're not going to see themselves reflected in the practice, which I think is really important for people to engage in it. They need to see themselves in it and understand that it is accessible and open for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, a few times I think people have been surprised that I'm the teacher. Like I may have checked them in at the desk and then I walk in and stand in the teacher role in the front of the room. And in my experience, I didn't have very many people of color school teachers or other teachers that I interacted with throughout my childhood and growing up. And so I think it's just a different experience, or can be for some people.
Mm-hmm. I can appreciate that, being a middle-aged male attempting to go to a yoga class and feeling part of the class, but my physical limits as well as confidence and skill uh, invited me to go off to the side because I needed to just have a little comfort space and not be in the spotlight and under the microscope. So it's a very interesting experience to be on the outs in some form, even though they are welcoming environments.
Mm-hmm.
You had mentioned that you were going to graduate school in social work. Tell us about your career in practice.
I went to grad school at UNC Chapel Hill, and I graduated in 1998 with my master's in social work. And then I'd gone to school, and I knew I wanted to be in private practice at some point, but I got out of school and worked as a high school social worker. I worked at the Rape Crisis Center. I worked at UNC and the Counseling Center. And I started a private practice along the way. And I specialize in working with folks who've experienced trauma. Usually it's sexual violence or intimate partner violence. I work with people who have body image issues and eating disorders. And then I do a lot of racial identity work, or just developmental identity work, focused on different identities that are oppressed in our culture.
Mm.
And I've been in private practice since 2001, and I went in private practice full time in 2009.
That's a big step because there's a lot of therapists and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of healing modalities in the Chapel Hill Carborough area,
Yes.
let alone the Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
However, it also invites many people to explore these modes. When did you sense that yoga could be part of a therapeutic modality for your clients?
Well, I remember in school learning a little bit about, it was a while ago. I feel like now it's more mainstream in social work programs to talk about the mind-body connection, but I remember it being introduced in school. And then I remember sitting in my office with clients or running groups and talking about it, but not actually practicing it. And at some point, that didn't make any sense to me. It was after I went through yoga teacher training, and I went through teacher training with the intention of incorporating yoga into the psychotherapy practice and into everything that I ended up doing. So that was my intention around it. And so one day I just got really tired of talking to clients about how to breathe, and I wanted to just teach them how to do that and lead them through breathing activities or meditations or visualizations. And I really started incorporating this in my private practice probably around 6 years ago. I have a little yoga room in my office now. We renovated it so I could have that. And I told my clients I was shifting my practice so that we would start with a breathing and centering, or we would end with that. And I mainly lead folks through meditation and breath work, sometimes movement. But because I'm working with people who've experienced trauma, and often it's physical trauma in some way, I'm not moving them very much or very quickly. I'm just starting with the centering and breathing because that can feel safer for people.
Hmm. It's an important element, especially in trauma, for feeling safe.
Mm-hmm.
We're confident of that. So if you could you throw out an idea or two for therapists and or therapy patients in how they could invite yoga into the therapeutic setting?
Well, for therapists, I think it's um, really nice to start with, even if it's just 2 minutes at the beginning of a session, an individual session or a group session, but where you're just centering. So you're asking people to notice they've arrived in the space, and you're asking them to focus on their breath, and they don't have to close their eyes to do that. They can just notice that they're breathing. And for what it does for the therapist is it gives us a chance to center too before we're going to engage in work and be present with an individual client or with a group. So it's, that simple. It could be moving through 10 deep breaths and setting some intention for the session, or asking the client to focus on what's present for them and how they want to bring that into the session. And then for clients or people who are engaged in therapy, when you're outside of the therapist office, it can be nice there are a lot of resources online, and there are lots of resources on iTunes at university for breathing, and there's some around yoga nidras that are for deep rest and deep sleep. A lot of my clients struggle with sleep issues because of their traumas. So there are a lot of resources that you can find to just allow yourself to center, to breathe. There are some poses that are specific for depression and anxiety. So I'd encourage people, therapists and clients, to do a little bit of research to find those resources that are available.
Wonderful. Well, you had mentioned the idea of centering and grounding, and we're going to prepare for our first pearl, where Michelle does share some of the concepts of centering and grounding. Let's view the first commercial pearl of wisdom.
I've found that when I am engaging in social action or outreach or engagement in the community, that it's really helpful to ground and center before I show up for the work. The way that I ground and center is to sit or stand, and I take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And sometimes I close my eyes so I can go inward. I start to notice how I feel in my body, and I notice any emotions that are moving through. And then I set an intention for the work. And this is an intention or a mantra that I can come back to as I move through the work. An example is, I will remember to breathe. I will remember that this work is about something much bigger than me. I am showing up for other people in this work. So to practice this in the future, you might take a moment to consider the work that you want to do, what inspires you, and then to prepare for the work, take a moment to ground and center and come up with a statement, a mantra that you can revisit as you move forward with your work. You can try it and then adjust as you need.
It's a wonderful perspective. We're going to invite teachers and practitioners to share if they have thoughts or ideas about social action and how yoga can be part of that. If you'll call in, you can call at 919-518-9773. You can Skype in at Computers 2K Voice, Computers 2K Voice. You can also log in and chat with us on the Nissan Communications website page for You Call This Yoga. So we welcome your engagement and perspectives. We're going to come back to Michelle and ask her to elaborate a little bit more about this intention setting and how that can tie into your or anyone else's social action.
Yeah, so I mentioned in the Pearl the importance of setting an intention for the work. And I should say that when I talk about social change work, I'm talking about that very broadly. I feel like there are lots of ways that people can make change and become involved in their communities and follow their hearts around what inspires them. And usually that comes from noticing what's going on around them in the world and then responding and wanting to do something to shift things. So I think it's important to set an intention because in a lot of social change movements, so organizing movements, people can lose focus of the intention or the goal, and it can cause a lot of disruption in the group that's actually trying to make change. So the group can actually replicate some of the things that they're fighting against if they aren't clear about the goal and their intention for it. And yoga, I feel like, is a really good teacher in this way because it does ask us to go inward and notice what's going on with ourselves in the moment. And it also, I think, calls us into something bigger by talking about things like nonviolence and compassion and truth telling, um, and just understanding how we relate to people and ourselves. And so I like to set an intention that's focused on knowing that this work of social change, of changing the world, is about something much bigger than me. And I always try to center that. So while my face might be in the front some of the time, it's not my ego that's in the front because I'm always focused on something bigger. And I'm doing this work because I believe in it and because I want to inspire people to change the world and the way that they're living and the way that we are relating to one another in this world.
Mm, that's lovely and very inspiring for me. I'm reflecting on the changes that I'm trying to affect, and they start with me, and then it also ripples just to my close relationships if I'm trying to change something. And then now as director of this organization, and we're trying to make a movement in our region. But I also find for me that my energies and focus can fluctuate. My passions can vary based on what's going on within and without. How, for you, do you keep your focus even on your own personal practices? Are there meditations or affirmations that work well for you?
Yes, I think I want to name that I think it's important for people to practice self care as they're doing social change work because there's no way to sustain the work unless we're taking care of ourselves. And I've seen a lot of activists burn out because, they want to be at the rally or in the street or protesting in some way, but they're not actually practicing self care. And you can't sustain that kind of energy without taking care of yourself. And so, what I do every day, and it's really for spiritual grounding in a way, I meditate every morning. I write gratitude statements, 10 of them every morning. I move through this guided meditation that's focused on self-love. And then if I have time, I have animal spirit cards and tarot cards and just affirmation cards. So I'll pick one of those for the day that will help guide me through. And if I can't get to it in the morning, then I make sure I get to it in the afternoon or in the evening. And if I'm traveling, I have a little candle I'll take with me and a deck of cards that I'll take with me, and the meditation's recorded so I can listen to it. So I try to practice this ritual every day so I can stay centered and grounded in the work and come back it's a way of coming back to myself and moving inward so I can then be intentional about how I'm moving in the world and outwardly.
Hmm. And is there a particular website or link or organization that you draw your meditation from?
It's actually from a workshop that I went to that was focused on, it's a therapy technique that is called EMDR, and it's focused on trauma, working with folks who've experienced trauma. And it's this meditation is what therapists will use at the end of a session with a client, and it focuses them on self-love and healing. And I'm not sure if this was intentional in the meditation because they weren't actually talking about yoga at this training, but there's some chakra work in it too. So they move through different color systems and then you set an affirmation at the beginning and end of it. So it's sort of a mixture of lots of different, I think, modalities or techniques that people can use.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I know that Barbara Vosk, who was on a couple weeks ago, or three, also is a therapist and has employed EMDR in her therapeutic settings or setting for clients over the years. And I remember that coming on, and it had to do with some reprogramming of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, for our audience, clarify what the letters EMDR mean and Not necessarily that we have to dive deeply into that, but what is the brain science in using that technique?
So EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which I think is a tricky name. And clients are often afraid when I say that that's what it means, but then I describe it. What I really like about it is that the idea is that it unlocks the nervous system. So it's sort of like hypnosis in that there is bilateral stimulation. So a client might be listening to a tone in their right and left ear back and forth, or they might hold on to something that's tactile that buzzes right and left, or I can move my fingers, like people have seen in hypnosis, to unlock the nervous system. Because the idea is that trauma gets locked in the nervous system and that we just reprocess it and replay it over and over with the same emotions and body sensations and thoughts. And so what EMDR does is through the bilateral stimulation, it unlocks the nervous system and allows someone to reprocess the trauma, which they aren't telling me. It's a lot of internal processing, actually. So they're reprocessing the trauma and trying to create distance, so a buffer between them and the trauma, and also a new belief, sort of like a new affirmation that they can live into. And they get to release some of the emotions and the sensations that were attached to that trauma. And I really like it because I feel like it does call in the mind-body connection and awareness. And the client, it doesn't require the client to tell me all the details of what happened to them. In fact, they're processing internally, and I'm just asking them to take a deep breath and tell me what they notice. But they don't have to share the details. And it's the therapeutic intervention that I use the most in my practice since I work with folks who've experienced trauma.
So, in a sense, managing trauma is one's own social action
Mm-hmm.
in trying to heal some injustice that has
Yeah.
occurred, and it's beyond their initiation and control, likely, and that has
Mm-hmm.
come to be.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, I've come to notice how Yoga Nidra has been incorporated in our Department of Defense
Mm-hmm.
therapies, and that has gained widespread acceptance. How is Yoga Nidra and EMDR similar, if at all? Because it seems that there's been a progression of EMDR to Yoga Nidra in the world that I have seen.
Well, I think one of the connections that you're making is EMDR was developed a while ago, decades ago, and it was used with people who were veterans initially and focused on their trauma. So I'm not surprised the Department of Defense is incorporating in Yoga Nidra or other forms of yoga too, actually, into their work. It's the way that they're done is a little different. I think what a client might or person might feel from EMDR after is similar to what a person will feel after they complete a yoga nidra. There is, an affirmation or sankalpa that you set in the yoga nidras that I've practiced before, and so that relates to the EMDR because of the positive affirmation or cognition you're trying to internalize,
Mm-hmm.
and that's very similar. Yoga nidra is, is deep rest, and I think during EMDR, clients don't actively feel like they're resting, right? They're moving through a trauma, but
Mm-hmm.
again, at the end, they feel like they have some distance and they've sort of cleared out something. And I think people who practice yoga nidra feel that same way and more rested and relaxed.
Mm. Well, we're going to go back and invite you to join us if you have any questions for Michelle in regard to her therapeutic modalities for trauma as well as social action. Our phone number is 919 518 9773. Computers 2K Voice on Skype, or log in on our chat room. We're going to move towards our special sponsor spot, our Fun and Yum Good Health Tip. Did you ever have a quandary about what to put on your salad? Just want to have a simple flavor, not too much xanthan gum or carrageen or high fructose corn syrup? Well, let's cue into what Neomond has to say about this matter.
Hello, I'm Betty Solly with Neomond. Everyone wants to know how to make a healthy, delicious, and light salad dressing. Today we're going to show you how to do that with some simple ingredients. First things first, you're going to need good quality olive oil, and we've got you covered here at Neomond. So what's so great about olive oil? The main type of fat found in all kinds of olive oil is monounsaturated fatty acids, otherwise known as MUFAs. MUFAs have been found to lower LDL cholesterol levels. All right, so we've got our olive oil. Let's get started. Here we've got our olive oil. This is cold-pressed Lebanese olive oil. Lemons, garlic, sea salt.
Welcome you to research what is a MUFA, an MUFA. That's what Betty had mentioned on there. So feel free to share with us what a MUFA is in terms of an ingredient in olive oil. Let's see what happens and share that information. But we're going to MUFA back over here to Michelle and to learn more about her skill and action. Skill and action is also a reference from the Bhagavad Gita. So I'd like Michelle to clarify some of her foundation from this in the creation of her school and teaching program.
Sure. I'd been practicing yoga consistently for about 3 years, so daily, before I went through yoga teacher training in 2009. And I went to teacher training at Franklin Street Yoga. Lori Bergwin was my teacher there. And then I completed a 500-hour through Asheville Yoga Center later. And I knew I wanted to teach, and so some people go through teacher training to deepen their own relationship with themselves and their practice, and I wanted to do that, and I also knew I wanted to teach. But I was a social worker before I became a yoga teacher, and I was an activist before I became a yoga teacher. And so for a few years when I was teaching early on, I felt this desire. It wasn't really a tension between social justice and yoga, but the desire to integrate the two of those things. And I really wasn't sure how. And a friend of mine, we taught a workshop that was called Yoga for Social Change out at the Stone House, which used to be in Mebane, North Carolina. And the Stone House did a lot of work with activists, both retreats focused on self-care and then retreats that were focused on engaging in how you engage in the social change work that you do. And I was leading that workshop, Yoga for Social Change, with Claudia Horwitz. And she actually brought up the Bhagavad Gita, which I'd studied in my teacher training. But the Gita is something that you can study forever and ever. It's very profound. I feel like I read a page of it or a verse, and it sits with me for a long time. In this teacher workshop that we led, Claudia introduced the Gita, and she read the verses, "No effort is wasted, no gain ever reversed. Even a little bit of this practice will shelter you from sorrow." And then she also read the line that is, "Yoga is skill in action." And I remember hearing it and thinking, oh, this is the connection that I want to make. And it struck me and resonated in some deep way, because that's the name of my yoga school. And for me, when I heard both this idea of don't be focused on the outcome, don't put all of your energy into the outcome. It's fine to have a goal and an intention, but if you get focused on results, then you're going to lose sight of the way you're doing the work and the energy that you put in to the work, even if it doesn't end up the way you want it to. There's that piece. And then this idea that yoga, the practice of meditating, of breathing, of moving in the body, of practicing the yamas and niyamas, the principles, and part of the 8-limb path of yoga, that you can actually, it's a skill, right? You can be skillful in these actions, and yoga is calling us to do something in addition to just moving in our bodies for our own personal gain. And so that's what led me then to think about integrating in social justice in that conversation with yoga in the studio, and then eventually in my own yoga program and teacher training. And what led me to do the teacher training actually is I was in Africa. I'm an ambassador for the Africa Yoga Project and have been since 2011. And I've been to Kenya 4 times volunteering with them. One, I experienced yoga in a way that I had not before. It was very, very different. And I experienced community building through yoga, which I don't experience in studios very much here. And I experienced teaching leadership through yoga in the Africa Yoga Project program. And I was actually there when I said, I want to lead a teacher training, and I want to give people the opportunity to travel to Kenya with me through this teacher training. They don't have to do that for it, but it's an option for them if they want to volunteer with the Africa Yoga Project. So that's how Skill and Action came together, both this yoga for social change and then experiencing, I think, living embodied yoga for social change in Kenya in a very different way than I had ever experienced here in the States.
It's a really interesting synergy when we go to an advanced training that we're passionate about, and then something gets sparked, and the timing is right, and then we can go experience something that just ties into that readiness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's thrilling. I could appreciate that when I went to do my chair yoga training with Lakshmi Volkar. I was very compromised and physically, but very passionate in my desire to do action. And when chair yoga was shared with me, as well as 30 other teachers, there was a synergy there that inspired us to move further, mm-hmm. which is what became some of the foundation for You Call This Yoga programs. So that's fascinating to hear of the timing. But you also mentioned about being a social activist prior to your yoga teacher training. Can you cue us in on some of your perspectives and activities over the years?
Sure. The way that I think sort of formalized my activism, because I think I've been an activist for a long time, and I grew up with a mom who would not identify as radical or as an activist, but she was a special education teacher, and I was in her classroom a lot, and I saw how she cared for her students and their families. And I actually went to home visits with her because she was a single parent and didn't have any other place for me to go. And so I feel like she actually trained me in how to be an activist and how to always think about something bigger than myself and the intention around the work. And so prior to becoming I was a social worker. I'd finished school, and there was some opportunity in school for social activism through different student organizations and groups. And then I was volunteering with an organization that used to be in Durham called Lambda Youth Network, and it focused on it was youth-led, but working with folks who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. And I was on their board, and they sent all of the board members to a dismantling racism training. And I went there, and that also is a point that it shifted everything in my world, because it gave me language for what I felt like I'd been experiencing for a long time, but didn't have a framework for it, didn't understand institutional and cultural racism as those terms. I understood how it felt when I interacted with an institution, where I understood cultural norms and expectations and assumptions, but I didn't have a framework for it. So I went to that training, and through that, I became a trainer for Dismantling Racism Works. Mm-hmm. And so part of the activism work is educating people around oppression and doing anti-racism and anti-oppression work. And then that led to some other community organizing around different events in where I live in Carborough. And also I've done some organizing work with folks in Durham, just around different issues that are coming up in the community. And currently I serve on the Carborough Board of Aldermen, which is the town council for Carborough. So it's an elected position. And while that may not seem like activism, I think having a social worker as a leader on a town council or board is really important, because I feel like I bring the perspective of understanding that the decisions that we are making affect people's lives. And we might not actually walk in the shoes of the people's lives that we are making policy decisions about. And we need to be mindful about that. And I think that's an activist view or perspective while I'm sitting in the role of being a politician. So there are lots of different ways that I've engaged in activism.
Mm-hmm. Well, even as you're talking about your involvement as an alderman, and that you're making decisions for people based on your values or the input you have, it almost seems as leading a class or even a teacher training has a similar venue per se, in that you have your perspectives and that other people have their perspectives, and we're trying to work together for their betterment. But that you have an upper hand in that because you're a decision maker or a leader in that. And your trauma sensitivity also can play into that pretty well. When you have been addressing some activist issues, such as what you just mentioned in our region, and you've come across some strong headwind or resistance, how does your trainings and experiences influence you in negotiating these headwinds?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because headwinds are and roadblocks are part of the work. They're part of the process and the learning. And I am just aware and remind myself that I need to be persistent, and that that's one of the things that is sort of central to social change work, that it's a lifelong journey, that I haven't arrived, that I won't ever arrive, right? That I'm always learning, and that I don't know everything. And I really appreciate leaders who can acknowledge that they don't know what they don't know, and that they can be vulnerable. And I think I embody both of those things. And so when I hit a roadblock, I am not hard on myself about it. I'm not judgmental around it. I'm just trying to understand what happened and how it might actually lead me to experience something that is better than what I thought it could be. And I just try to look at the lessons that can come from that roadblock. And sometimes the roadblock or the sort of stumble is related to my own journey, and sometimes it's related to my interaction with other people and them having different perspectives and opinions. And I'm a person who really believes in multiple truths, so I'm aware that the truths that I'm even speaking now may not land for people, and they may not resonate for some people, and for others they will pretty deeply. And I am okay with that. Like, I feel like culture has taught me to be binary in my thinking, but that's not how I live. I choose to understand that there are multiple truths and multiple ways that people move in this world. And so that helps me respond to the roadblocks that emerge along the way.
So, in essence, a roadblock could be akin to a grain of sand in an oyster shell. And let's see how we coalesce this roadblock into another pearl of wisdom.
I found in my experience of doing social change work or social action work that it can be overwhelming if I think about all of the things that need to be in place for me to prepare or start the work. And so what's been helpful is for me to remember that social action is a practice. And things being a practice mean that it's going to be messy along the way, and that there are going to be some mistakes that I make, and there'll be some lessons that I learn from. And I found that it's really helpful to break down the steps for whatever action or goal that I have in mind for my social change work. And I just have to focus on the next step that I need to take. And then after I complete that step, I'll take another step. And I want to celebrate the accomplishments along the way, and hopefully these steps will add up to my goal related to my social action work.
It's almost as if we are in line to become lemonade masters,
Mm-hmm.
in that we have our intentions, and it's not necessarily the path that we see, but that there's so many other engagements along the way. So Michelle has a school, she has a mission, she has a career, she serves in the community. So what else do you do, Michelle, to take care of Michelle?
Well, that's a really good question. And in addition to the daily ritual that I mentioned, which is more about grounding and meditating and centering and preparing for my day, I have a daily practice of yoga as well. Um, and sometimes that's movement, and sometimes that's more meditation. And sometimes it's just living my yoga in the way that I'm interacting with people throughout the day. Um, and I've had to work really hard to take care of myself. I had a concussion 2 years ago, and it changed everything, I would say, and it also forced me to figure out how I was going to keep doing social change work and sustain myself, because after the concussion I was continuing to work but couldn't work as much because it was really hard to focus and concentrate, and that's what I have to do for my social work job, which is my main job. So I worked really hard to create quiet space and time for myself, to be intentional about the people that I was surrounding myself with, so my friends, and to really just listen to what I needed. And I try to practice that every day and think about, if I say yes to this, what someone's asking me to do, does that mean that I'm saying no to something that I actually really need? And so I think about boundaries a lot and just intention around self-care. So those are some of the things that I do.
How do you get a concussion doing yoga?
I didn't get the concussion practicing yoga. I actually slipped on ice, so everyone should be careful.
Oh gosh.
And I hit the back of my head on the way to work to see a client, and realized very quickly that I had a concussion. So it's been a long journey. They're not easy to recover from at all, but I'm still here.
Wow. Well, it takes a lot of insight just to be able to realize that you have a concussion.
Yes. Well, I had a headache, and I was
Okay.
slurring my speech, so those were signs.
Obviously, not a guy who would have said, "Oh, I just have a boo-boo,"
Right?
and
Yeah.
just kept on keeping on. Recently, I read that you're having a special event on April 1st
Mm-hmm.
with a couple of our dear friends, Donnie Strauss and Katie Valita, who are participating at Yoga Fest in Acro Yoga. But tell me about your endeavor with Katie and Donnie.
So Katie and Donnie are very good friends of mine and also colleagues of mine. And it was after the election, actually, that Katie, I think the three of us were together hanging out, and Katie said, we should do a workshop together. And she was really fired up about it. And the three of us, I think, are a good team in that we focus our social change work in different areas. And I just think coming together, melding those together is really powerful. And so we were supposed to lead this workshop in January, but it got snowed out. So we're leading it on April 1st in Chapel Hill. It's from 10 to 4 p.m. And it's on the Skill in Action Michelle C. Johnson website, and also on the Skill in Action Facebook page, so if you want more information about it. I'm going to focus on talking about social change and social justice in yoga. Katie and Donnie are going to lead acro yoga, and then Donnie is also going to talk about bhakti yoga, so yoga from the heart, and that's why it's called Ignite the Heart. We wanted to, since we'd scheduled it for after the election, we noticed that lots of people were feeling demoralized or dehumanized, and feeling sort of lost and not sure where to put their energy. And so that's why we planned it that way. But it's still timely. Things are still happening on a daily basis as a result of this world that we live in, and the election. And so we still feel like it's timely, and that people want a space to go to connect to their hearts and to move and to breathe, and then to think about how they want to be in the world.
That sounds rich.
It's going to be great. I'm excited about it.
That's lovely. And in this process of collaborating with Donnie and Katie, it sounds like there's different elements of yoga in there. And I think some of our message, well, not some, a big part of our message is that there's many elements of yoga that are accessible. Acro yoga can be rather sophisticated and very measured, but there's a beauty in the partnering of that, but it's not for everybody. It's not necessarily an endorphin-inducing, sweat-pouring experience that makes you forget about everything, but it sure can bring your focus to the here and now because you're partnering with someone. Similarly, Michelle also mentioned bhakti yoga, another limb on the tree. Could you explain some of how bhakti and social action meld together?
Sure. And I'll mention that Donnie's one of the guest teachers that comes into my teacher training, and she trains the group about bhakti, and she leads them through a kirtan. And she also does some mantra work with the class. And so what I'm offering is from my experience with her and a few other bhakti teachers. And I think the yoga from the heart is so related to social change, because part of the transformational work that I want to do and have been doing is based on shifting the heart and connecting to the heart and moving the heart and living from the heart instead of the head. I say in yoga classes, that our minds will get us in trouble, like follow your breath and the sensations in your body, and focus on your intention, because if you let your thoughts get in the way, you're going to get off balance, you're going to fall over, you're going to be distracted and not in this actual physical space anymore. And so bhakti yoga is really focused on how do we, I think in some ways, crack open the heart. That's how I've experienced it. Particularly the part of bhakti that is about chanting and kirtan and the call and response. And not needing to know the words and not being able to chant perfectly, but doing it anyway and using the voice. And Donnie talks a lot about the connection of the heart and the throat in her work with bhakti. So I feel like, if someone, if this social change work was just all about thinking, then someone really brilliant would have figured out how to shift and change all of these social issues that we're experiencing and the horrific things that are happening. If we could just think it away, someone would have done that. And I feel like it's calling for more. And the connection to bhakti is that it's calling for us to do something different in our bodies and through our hearts. It's not actually our minds that are going to get us out of the mess that we're in. It's our hearts. And then moving that outwardly and thinking about how we want to live in this world, because we're in a world with other people, and how do we want to relate to one another.
And it seems very easy in some of this tense environment to harden one's heart to other people and to feel a little foot dug in and just trying to hold one space and losing perspective on what other people, who are really people,
Right.
are experiencing. I was thinking just recently about food and how some people are just less critical of what they're eating because they've come from a place where it's just been more challenging to actually have food, as opposed to being picky about food. And even though we have these great fun and yum tips that are coming, and we have some really nice fancy food on there, it's not always easy just to have food. And that's why we're also making our tips simple, so that people can enjoy without having a very complex life or a set of ingredients. So for viewers that are practitioners, we can consider the idea that there are small practices that you can develop either in self-care or relationships, or expanding your edges just a little bit to be exposed to more people or experiences that may change your perspective. Action doesn't have to be a gross element. It could be small steps, daily practices. Teachers, there's other ways that you're influencing your students, probably beyond what you know. There's subtleties in your practices and messages. Michelle, do you have any nuances or perspectives that teachers can start to incorporate into their messaging?
Yes, your question's making me think about what students would say about their experience with me teaching, and I think that they would say that I do offer an accessible space in the sense of allowing people to move in the way that they want to move. So I am leading and I am cueing and I'm inviting people to listen to their bodies more than they're listening to me. I say that at the beginning of class. You know, that their body is wise and I don't know what's going on internally for them. So I really create an environment where people start to learn to listen to their own inner wisdom and inner voice. And they can use that on the mat and off of the mat too, as they move in their lives in the world. So that's one way, I think, offering modifications, inviting the student to actually be their own teacher, even if we're there as a guide, but really the practice is about them in that moment and not about us and needing to do the most advanced posture. I am really aware, and I notice this a lot in classes, there's some assumptions that are made about gender identity in classes. So a teacher will assume everyone's a woman in the class, but not actually know that. And I really try to stay away from that and gendering people because I don't actually know. And I feel like it's sort of a simple modification that a teacher or adjustment could make instead of assuming that they know everyone's background or gender identity or expression in the class. And I feel like it really can shut people down. So that's one way. And then with adjustments, if teachers are offering adjustments to have some way of asking permission around that. And I do that sometimes at the beginning of class by saying, you know, you'll hear me or see me near you. Well, sometimes students don't actually hear me and see me before I'm coming over to adjust them. So I might ask them to, if they can raise their hand, raise a hand while everyone's in a pose where you can't actually see what's going on for other people. But I want to give students the choice of having an adjustment or not, and I don't want them to feel like they have to say yes to me because I'm the teacher. So I'm really aware of the role of the teacher and the power differential, and I feel like teachers could be more aware of that. Like we hold a lot of power in the classroom, and students pretty much will do what we ask them to do, and that is, it's important not to abuse that or to understand how much power that actually is. You know, if I ask my students in a flow class to lift their right leg, most of them are going to do that. But maybe, or if I ask them to move into a lunge, with their back leg extended, most of them are going to do that, even if they need to modify with their back knee on the ground, right? And so I just want to invite people to really, really be gentle with themselves, again, to cultivate that inner voice and inner wisdom, and to have this choice about whether or not they want to be adjusted in some way.
I know some studios use the chip system too, where you can have a chip if you don't want to be adjusted and the teacher knows not to touch it.
Yeah, I like that system.
We have one more chip, also known as a pearl of wisdom, to share with you to start to wrap the show up. Let's see what this pearl shines.
When I'm engaging in social change work or activism, I always come back to one of my guiding principles that comes from the Bhagavad Gita. And the verse in the Gita says, "No effort is wasted, no gain ever reversed." And then it's talking about the practice of yoga, and it goes on to say, even a little bit of this practice will shelter you from sorrow. And I always come back to that verse and center in that and ground in that as a guiding principle in my work, because it's important to not be attached to the outcome, not be attached to the results, but to focus on the process and the way that I'm doing the work and my approach to the work. And so as you're doing your social change work, you can think about the process, the steps that you're taking, the lessons learned, and you can lean into the possibility that what will happen as a result of your work will be much greater and better than what you could have ever imagined.
I really enjoy Michelle's quoting of the Bhagavad Gita. I've used that as a reference for me in the lamenting of Arjuna in having to go into battle, and the essence of how it is essential, and even though it's of conflict and of discomfort and it feels like one's fighting family, that this is about exerting what we believe is good and right. And skill in action is part of that path. Michelle has a school that is teaching teachers about service. You Call This Yoga has met with these teachers in trying to bring service to youth in the Chapel Hill Carborough area. Fortunately, they were so empowered that they didn't really need the organization and just to confer with us, and that they had all the capacity within them with a little bit of coaching from their mentor, Michelle. So we invite you to consider that activism can happen collectively or individually. You can build some team. Michelle can be consulted for a few more minutes or via her website, skillandaction.com. Yes? Did I get that right?
It's michellcjohnson.com, and on there you'll see a yoga teacher training and skill in action. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I was close. At least
You
I
were
got
very
it.
close.
At least
The
I got her
title was
name right.
Yeah. All the rest was right.
Michelle is leading a special seminar on April 1st with Donnie Strauss and Katie Valida. And also she is producing a book eventually over the next several months. So stay tuned. You can keep up with Michelle on her Skill and Action Facebook page, as well as reaching out to her via her website. Also, coming up in the near future, we have Yoga for Athletes with Sage Roundtree. We have Yoga for 12-Step Recovery with Celia Hartnett. Those two are coming up in the next 2 weeks. Our shows in March will be at 9:30 to 10:30, as I'll be teaching at NC State for a few weeks. I'm thrilled to do that. We're doing chair yoga at the Lifelong Learning Institute. Coming up for You Call This Yoga in the next month is Yoga Fest NC. It's an all-day retreat with a wonderful lunch from our sponsor, Neiman Deli and Catering. We invite you to send in your questions or comments on our chat. Just log in and call in 919-518-9773 or Skype in for just a few more minutes if you like. Michelle has shared some of her perspectives about being a teacher as well as an activist, but she also has a studio that she participates in called Carborough Yoga.
Carborough Yoga Company.
Carborough Yoga Company. Yes, sorry, I got a little blip there. Tell me about some of the classes that you teach at Carborough Yoga in case anyone's willing to come meet you nearby.
Sure. So I teach at Carborough Yoga Company. I teach now 3 classes a week on Sunday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. All of the classes that I teach there currently are flow classes, so we move with the breath in those classes, and I do offer modifications. And the studio has a lot of different classes. In the past, I've taught classes focused on yoga for depression and anxiety and how to decrease those. I've taught a weekend workshop there on social justice and yoga. And there's so many choices there and lots of great teachers. So if you want a flow class and want to move in that way, I'm there. But again, there are lots of different, there's yin yoga, there's gentle yoga, there's restorative yoga. So there are a lot of different options there, and it's a great studio space.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. Remember, practitioners, yoga is a life science, not just a physical act. Your actions and how you move through the world are your yoga. Teachers, let's keep the students engaged, but be mindful that they have issues that we're clearly not fully aware of. I'm practicing that every class I go to and trying to remember what don't I know. What we do know is that it's time to wrap up. We look forward to seeing you next week at 9:30. We have Michelle Johnson today to thank. We appreciate you very much, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
And of course, we appreciate Amnon, our producer.
Yes, thank you.
And I just wanted to repeat, it's you see her name on the videos, Michelle Johnson, but it's the website. It's michellcjohnson.com.
.com.
Okay.
michellcjohnson.com.
Lots of Michelle Johnson. So
So you don't see this one and see them all. It's this one.
yeah.
See you next week. Namaste.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.